お嬢様。
Hello my lords and ladies, Joe here, and today I'd like to talk to you about the upcoming melee DPS in Dawntrail. Now I know what you might be thinking, yeah, another job prediction video, I've seen enough of those already. And while it's true I came up with my own list of t-shirt related predictions, I personally give the most credence to this theory. So if it isn't pointing to something specific, rather just the subsect of a job, how do we even theorize about it? Why, by using one of the biggest influences on Final Fantasy, Dungeons & Dragons. From Bahamut to the Displacer beast resembling Coral, Dungeons & Dragons has been a key source of inspiration in the Final Fantasy series. So I say, let's take a look on how it could be used once again to inspire the next job. Now D&D has a ton of classes, but the best place to look is with the obvious, meaning the Rogue. As Rogue and its job Ninja is the only scouting class in Final Fantasy XIV, the D&D Rogue is the perfect jumping off point, more specifically its subclasses. I'll be using the ones seen in 5th edition, and it should go without saying that D&D doesn't translate very well to a strictly combat focused MMORPG playstyle like FF14. So instead of trying for a literal interpretation, I'll be using the themes and aesthetics of these subclasses to predict what job could be added to FF14, while using the Final Fantasy series and other MMOs to help solidify the concept. And while we're on the subject of scouting, if you are scouting out this channel, why not leave a like and a sub? Let's begin with the Arcane Trickster. The Arcane Trickster has a focus on illusions, which could be an inspiration for an Illusionist job. And while Illusionists appear in the Final Fantasy Tactics series, they're more like a red mage with white mage aesthetic. So let's turn our eyes to another MMO, with its own Illusionist class, Guild Wars 2, and its Mesmer profession. Now the big gimmick of Mesmers are their clones. An Illusionist could place down clones that could do different things. Maybe one pulses an AoE around it, another does melee damage to a single target. Maybe instead of strafing around the boss for its positionals, it could shadow step leaving behind a clone. Or maybe a counter where if the Illusionist is hit, it will create a clone that will shield it from some damage. There are a lot of possibilities. Each clone could remain stationary, meaning the Illusionist would have to stay in melee range. It could also adopt the Shatter theme of the Mesmer, breaking the clones to cash out on some damage, similar to how Machinist does with its Overheat and Rook. Lost Ark's Reaper Assassin also has a Shadow clone mechanic that works not only to do damage, but to mitigate threat. The only real problem I see with this idea is that it could be stepping on the toes of Ninja and Dark Knight, with their Bushin and Living Shadow abilities respectively. But I still think there is a possibility for an illusion-based scouting job. Next, Assassin. As for Final Fantasy, believe it or not, Assassins are a reoccurring class. However, Ninja does seem to have a huge overlap with Assassin. Final Fantasy XIV's Ninja has the Assassinate ability, though it does get replaced by Dream Within a Dream. Most of the Assassin iterations in Final Fantasy just look like Ninja. Take Assassin's most iconic character, Shadow. But Assassins in Final Fantasy are known for adding debilitating effects, and this got my noggin a-joggin'. Maybe Assassins could be a poison job, coating their weapons in different poisons for different effects. Maybe dropping AoE damage over time poison spots. We could see the return of a Dot class. World of Warcraft's assassination rogues also fit into this theme. Now I know it sounds like wishful thinking considering the recent developments against damage over time abilities, but maybe Square Enix killed Summoner's Dots so that Assassin could live. Next, probably the most tragic of subclasses, Thief. Thief is a classic Final Fantasy class dating all the way back to the original Final Fantasy. Many beloved characters in this series have been thieves. Yuffie, Zidane, and Riku, just to name a few. Thief was even its own class in Final Fantasy XI, separate from Ninja. I know there are many Final Fantasy fans who would like to see the return of Thief. Unfortunately, almost everything that made thieves in Final Fantasy have been absorbed by Rogue, and ultimately ninja. There would need to be a rogue and ninja rework to the likes we have never seen to make thief a possibility in Final Fantasy XIV. And I just don't see that happening. For argument's sake, let's say they made thief more akin to the Guild Wars 2 profession of the same name. The mechanic I see separating it the most would be the preparation skills. Preparations are like traps, but instead of them being triggered when an enemy is in range, the thief manually sets it off, which could work for some interesting combinations and utilities. Thieves in Guild Wars 2 also use Venom, the possibilities of which I've already discussed with Assassin. Still, even if Square Enix decided to use any of these mechanics for a job, I doubt that job would be called Thief. But I wouldn't say it's impossible. Now, when you hear the Inquisitive class, you might think that I mispronounced Inquisitor, but no. This is basically a detective class.
So basically, Hildebrand the job.
I guess you could say that Arcane could become a job, but I think we all know that wouldn't fit. What with Sage already being a thing. But if we dig deep, we can look at the iconic Final Fantasy ability Scan. Maybe there could be a job that gives temporary vulnerable status, like Ninja's Mug. Maybe they give all melee DPS a buff akin to True North. I don't see enough to base a whole job around Scan, especially when it's already associated with Scholar and Blue Mage. Better to give that ability to an existing job rather than make a whole new one. As for any other MMO, I couldn't really find any other class that stood out as a detective, further adding to the idea that this just wouldn't fit. Mastermind runs into similar issues. While it could be an interesting ability for a job to have a reverse cover, a melee that could redirect damage to a tank, the trolling possibilities are too great for me to see this implemented. The Mastermind aesthetic kind of reminded me of a niche Final Fantasy class, the Orator. The biggest characteristic of an Orator is the ability to recruit enemies, and I don't see that happening in Final Fantasy XIV, outside of maybe a Beastmaster limited job. Orators also give party buffs, which is a unique idea considering healers have Astrologian and physical range have Bard. I don't really consider Dragoon's Battle Litany to be filling this melee niche, so maybe we could see an Orator as a scouting class. I kind of like the idea of a job using their words rather than their fists to fight, but I'm not too hopeful. Now for the most name-appropriate subclass of this video, Scout. A scout has a scouting job. I doubt Square Enix would be so on the nose. But what's more important than its name is the theme, with the bow and arrow being taken by the bard. There is no class that fits the wilderness ranger aesthetic that a scout could bring. And with the untamed wilderness vibe that the new world is invoking in the Dawn Trail trailer, this might be the expansion to fill this niche. Now, it would be a little much to call this job Scout, and naming it after the Final Fantasy reoccurring class of Ranger doesn't sound right as a melee class. However, Ranger is sometimes referred to as Hunter, and we can't really talk about Hunter without bringing up World of Warcraft's infamous class, more specifically the Survival spec. Survival Hunters not only fill the out into the wild feel, but it's also a melee class. Survival Hunters in WoW have a poison vibe, which we've already discussed, and they also have traps, a concept we have yet to see in Final Fantasy XIV. Using traps could be a very versatile job mechanic that would fit in right next to Ninja. Now, people associate hunters with having a pet, but I don't think this is a necessary component. While it would be fun to see the return of a pet class, especially after Summoner's rework, I'm standing by my Beastmaster Limited job being the pet class that will be added. Now for the class everyone seems to be clamoring for, Swashbuckler, or as Final Fantasy XI would call it, Corsair. Everyone seems to think that this will be the next job. People see the Warrior of Light on a boat and they go, Pirates! Also, it's an aesthetic that many have been pushing for. Ever since 1.0 with its never-released Musketeer class, there has been some unfinished business dealing with a pirate-themed job. Now we can't really talk about the Corsair without bringing up the far more conventional Final Fantasy class it was based off of, Gambler. Now I personally thought there wasn't any room for a gambler in Final Fantasy XIV, with Astrologian already taking their card theme, and the draw mechanic feeling as close to a gambler's slot ability as an MMO would allow. However, I remember that Astrologian is getting a rework in Dawntrail, and if Endwalker's Summoner rework is anything to go by, Astrologian may come out looking like a completely new job, paving the way for a melee DPS gambler. Even if we assume that Astrologian still has its cards and draw mechanic, Gambler still has its dice theme, something that was more present in Final Fantasy XI's Corsair. Corsair was known for its trademark weapon, the hexagon. Many see this as a butting of heads with the gun-wielding machinist. But you know, I find it a little weird that some say that there can't be another gun class when we have 4 jobs that use swords, and an additional 2 that are practically swords. Machinists use rifles that they place on their backs. There is definitely room for a sidearm gun job. We already see sidearms being used by the musketeer NPCs. But if it's a gun class, then why would it be a melee DPS? Well, it could be like a reverse red mage. Build up resources at melee and then unleash a distance-based gun combo. Considering the mobility options that most Final Fantasy XIV jobs have, this is by no means a stretch concept. And look at Ninja, which is a melee job and has a lot of range abilities. World of Warcraft also has the Outlaw Rogue, which fits into both the pirate and gambler theme. So maybe the FF14 devs could take inspiration from the Roll the Bones ability. Black Desert Online has their own dedicated Corsair class. Going back to weapons, the BDO Corsair uses a sword whip, which is something unique and could very well be the next weapon for a new job. Keeping with the BDO Corsair's mobility theme, the job could use the whip to latch onto enemies and swing around them to get positionals instead of just strafing. I'm not really sure about the Corsair's mermaid and water theme, but hey, maybe the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles shapeshifter theory does have something to it. If we look at the Corsair's Awakened theme, it goes full pirate, with a crew that fires cannons, gangs up on enemies, and even drops an anchor on them. The idea of summoning NPCs to help you isn't something I'm sure would fit into Final Fantasy XIV, but who knows? The Awakened Corsair uses a weapon that looks like a mix between a sword and a gun. We already have a gunblade, not too sure there is room for a blade gun. Now we're going to get into some more far out there concepts. First, the Phantom. The D&D Phantom has an interesting resource mechanic that after something dies, you will gain a soul trinket. But this already sounds too close to the Reaper's aesthetic. With the Phantom's connection to death, it's hard not to bring up necromancy/necromancers. Now, necromancy has been a thing in Final Fantasy XIV since 1.0, so there's definitely in-game lore that would support a necromancer job. The Final Fantasy series has its own necromancer, which was like an undead version of Blue Mage, having to learn their dark arts from enemies. So I don't really see that coming into play. You could look towards Necromancer in Guild Wars 2 for inspiration, such as inflicting negative statuses on yourself and then choosing whether or not to give these statuses to enemies, or changing them into boons for yourself or party members. There could be abilities that the Necromancer can only use when they take damage, so they have self-harm tools, similar to how Dark Knights would play in other iterations in the Final Fantasy series. But an even better fit from Guild Wars 2 would be the Thief's elite specialization, Spectre. Spectre is a support class that tethers themselves to allies to give them bonuses, similar to Dancer's dance partner or Sage's Cardia. The other big mechanic they use is wells, which are like persistent traps. Whether they hurt enemies or help allies, their effects persist so long as they are stood in. It could be an interesting tool used in Final Fantasy XIV. There are some issues though. First, the Necromancer in Final Fantasy has always been portrayed as a magic-based class, including the Necromancers we've seen in Final Fantasy XIV. but it is possible we could see a melee class that uses mage-like abilities. After all, ninja can use fire, ice, and lightning, which are the primary elements used by black mage. Maybe the next scouting melee job could use attacks with a necromancy theme. But the bigger problem for necromancers is the theme itself. I can't point to specifics, but I believe the topic of necromancy has been brought up to Yoshi P before. And from what I recall, he basically said necromancy is evil, therefore the Warrior of Light would never do it. Combine that with the sunny, happy tone we've been seeing in Dawntrail so far, I don't really think this expansion of all times would have a death-themed job released. That would be some real subversion of expectations.
Finally, we have the Soul Knife. The Soul Knife's theme is that of a psychic, which summons blades.
We've already talked about Guild Wars 2's Mesmer, but if we look at Mesmer's elite specialization, Virtuoso, you can see how this might be implemented in an MMO, building up a stock of psychic blades to unleash on enemies. We've also seen a psychic class in Final Fantasy X too, which had a focus on teleportation and damage absorption. While a psychic job could be cool, I see several issues with it. First is the aesthetic. Does a psychic really fit into Final Fantasy XIV? I mean, Aether is a source of power, but using your literal mind? Astrologians, red mages, and sages already have weapons controlled by your character. So isn't everyone already using telekinesis? I know it's weird complaining about the aesthetic of a psychic in a game that has chocobos standing next to flying cars, but I don't know, it just feels off. As for the magic knife theme, we already have red and blue mages using spells that summon magic swords to attack enemies. And to top it off, sages' weapons sometimes look like floating blades. If we went the more Final Fantasy II Psychics route, it was a class that wasn't really fleshed out enough to inspire a fully fledged FF14 job. You could teleport, you could absorb damage, and the psionic attacks were kind of all over the place, so it can't really lend itself to a strong theme. The only argument I can make is that psionics is such a broad concept that you could mold it into something completely new. Those were all the rogue subclasses from D&D 5e and how their themes could fit into Final Fantasy XIV. What do you think? Which one of these would you like to see the most? Do you think there's another way that these subclasses could be played? Is there another Dungeons & Dragons subclass you could see fitting into the game? Let me know in the comments below. Show some class yourself and leave a like and a sub, and I'll see you in the world of tomorrow.